to speakers. Let's just wait Sabeena for a second. She grabs the headphones. Just to say like that, yeah, we try to keep this discussion in 2 languages, so be aware that English speakers of this conference might also need the translation. And thank you so much. It's incredible actually collection of presentations of women from very different, from starting the taking image up to its final production, and then Karali, and how it's important, and how actually at every stage the women's work stays invisible. Quite appalling in a way. I want straight away to open, because we don't have much time, we have some, of course, open the floor to the questions and commentary if anyone has something. Yeah, is Liga here? Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for the amazing panel. I really enjoyed listening to all the stories, and really fascinating, and related to many to a lot of things that you were talking about. Also, the research in periodicals, and also the archivist librarians' work, of course. And what struck me as surprising in one part of this panel was this aspect of when thinking about industrialization, industrial aspects of photography, that when we think about commercials, then women are often represented as mannequins, right? Like in commercials, they're pretty, and they're, I mean, representing and everything. But when we start to think about and talk about where are women actually in the practice, we find out that there are all of these layers of actually these like power relations, right? Where women are trying to take up space, and they're said that like, no, we don't really have money for you, or we don't really have space for you, we're not interested of you having there, and aspects like that. So I don't know, like these observations, and then again a comment on Audrey's paper on the work of librarians. And I mean, like, there are so many of these invisible aspects that came up here, like these different layers of being obscured and invisible in photography. Like today came up this question about that photography is not just pressing the button, right? But there are all of these aspects in industrialization, like industrial aspects, and creating these papers and objects and everything. And then of course also like women being the ones who archive all of this, and then make it accessible, and etc. I don't know if I really have a question or something. It was just an amazing panel, and I just wanted to share that I'm so really happy to be able to like listen to all of these, all of your stories. Thank you so much.
Does anyone have something to respond, or we'll take another question?
I just a quick response to because you talked about commercials, and because my presentation actually looks at I mean, I've been very fascinated by the Kodak advertisement and Kodak advertisements, and I have done some work on them. And I think that sometimes maybe you need to, like I said, you have to look at the margins. So sometimes it's the main frame will have the man, and I know that there has been work on this in the past, on Kodak advertisements where men were taking the pictures and they were at the center of the nuclear family, because Kodak gradually in India moves away from the joint family, which is a larger extended family, to the mother, father, children. And it's a new nuclear kind of family. And yet, if you look at these advertisements, and there's advertisement after advertisement, it's very tiny in the frame, but you really have to hunt for her on that. And again, I keep coming back to materiality, because so much of it is this really degraded newsprint, which is where I've got my archives. There are no archives in India. So my archives are actually print. my dissertation was actually on print culture, and I have basically just gathered all my material from newspapers, from tabloids, from magazines, and so on. And if you look carefully, then you will find this figure, and then you have to open up that discourse. So let me give you another example, that you will find women sometimes taking the camera, taking the photograph, and at times you will find a woman's hand holding pictures. Now, what does it tell you? It basically is also telling you that women were archivists. So they were also, maybe if they were not taking photographs, they were the ones looking after the family album, they were the ones sorting the album, they were the ones. So just as a, I don't know whether, it's not a response, but I'm just saying that perhaps sometimes one has to kind of look in a kind of an oblique kind of way.
Maybe I can just say one thing, because you were asking for advices, but I think it's very obvious. But when we are working on photographic founds and in archive in general, never forget that it was framed by other people, and you have to discuss with them and as a collaborative work, because they will help you to find and to understand what you are in front of, and you will help them to document it. So it would be this.
So any more commentary questions? Yeah. It's here. It's here. Here. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks. They were all really, really fascinating, and all that invisibilized labour. I was particularly taken with Audrey's, just because I used to work in a small photo agency in London just before everything died with the digital revolution. But yeah, one of the things I remember from then was that most of the people who were faxing us their picture requests were also women. So most of the people in those junior roles at newspapers, because I then, did that too. So it was a lot of women in the almost gatekeeping roles of what images get into newspapers and what didn't. And the other thing that I don't know if it's come across to people that you've interviewed, but it was such a fast environment. Like you would run from the fax machine to the filing cabinets and sort through the slides if it was for a daily newspaper. And then another job that we had to do was every day we had to check through all the daily newspapers to see how many images were used. So and then you were tested on your general knowledge. So there was so much that went into that role that then sort of disappeared, I guess. So yeah, I find it fascinating. Thank you.
Just to say something just to say to Audrey that my presentation was on amateur photographers, but I've also done a book on India's first woman press photographer, and she had a little ID card which I must send you now, because she was a member of the Black Star agency. So I used to always wonder, because I never ended up asking her about it. It was found after she passed away. And I will send you a copy of that, because clearly even in India, she was probably there must have been others, but she was, as a woman, she was a part of the Black Star agency.
Thank you.
Any more? Sorry. Yeah.
This is more of a curiosity for Katarzyna, your presentation. So because when I was starting out with my project, one of the things that I had considered was looking at women in photochemical factories. It did not lead me much to any place in the Indian context, also because although there were local agencies for photographies, companies in India, much of the production did not really happen in India until much later, in the 1960s, 70s. So because I was interested in the early 20th century, I could not really trace much. But the question I had for you is, I wanted to know more about the significance of women's role in these spaces, in terms of whether women working in these factories, were there any kinds of policy changes or decisions that were made based on them working in these companies, that then we can understand in having a role in shaping photo history. What I'm trying to get at is, because of the labor that women bring to the making of these photochemicals or things like that, and this comes from a personal interview that I had done with one of the women who talked about how constant exposure to chemicals that made it impossible for her to work in photography. It damaged her retina, things like that. So I was just wondering if there are other instances where women's presence in these spaces of these behind-the-scene presences can help us understand how photo history is shaped or how photography was shaped, if there were changes in policies, laws, or other kinds of things that might then reveal another alternative form of photography history because of women working in these factories.
I'm not sure I understand you right, but the majority of women that worked in the photon factory were not decisive. So they basically worked on the production, like it was, handicraft, packing and printing, and sometimes the darkroom labor. Only one that I have interviewed, there's one chapter devoted to a laboratory worker that actually worked on some revolutions in photography. She wanted to make some patents for some new chemical, I don't remember, emulsion for something. So this was like from the official point of the factory. Everything was conducted by men who were the officials. It was like 3% of the factory were male directors, of export directors, of accounting office director, whatever. But from what I have experienced is that women did not have these ambitions. They were. It was a communist time. Everybody was working everywhere in one or other factory, and usually, as I said, they worked like for the whole lifetime in one factory, usually with a husband or some other relatives, and they never said like they wanted to be the director of the factory, but they supported each other very much. We asked these gender questions about the life in the factory. For instance, how was it to be pregnant, or how was it to breastfeed the baby and work in these conditions? So there's a whole chapter about this, but usually it was just regulated by milk. So a woman because in communism everything was regulated, it was difficult to obtain sometimes even milk. So women that were in charge, that they were pregnant, they they would receive milk. But if that was the regulation enforced by women, they couldn't remember. Most of the women that I talked to came to work when it was already a law.
If I could have like a quick follow-up to that.
Yes.
Did you find any particular, say, advertisements or announcements for recruitment of these women? Or were there any special forms of understanding that why would women work in these factories? Or because I'm thinking of it in the UK context, where Nicola Hudgens' book talks about it a little bit, where women were thought of as particularly amenable to this kind of work. At the same time that their labor was undermined, that this is not important work enough, but women were thought of as their feminine hands or the patience that would need to do these arduous tasks, which made women more suitable for this kind of work. So I was wondering if in the archives there are such documents announcing or advertisements for women's recruitment that show that women are more favorable to do this kind of work than men. If you found anything like that.
I didn't find anything in the archives, but it was a general knowledge that men would go into the mining in Poland and women would go into the light industry like textiles and photography, basically.
So interesting.
I would also add, there's also women usually paid less, and it's cheaper labor,
Than
so
mining,
especially in industrial scale, because I did a project on another textile manufacturing. So that's also become a case quite often, why women start to be dominating in industries where the big number of people are required. So it's part of it also. But yeah, and it's also quite often division is built up in the industrialized territories. As Katarzyna like said, is men going like on a mining or some heavy industry, women going to the all other industries. It's, yeah, just...
You must remember that everybody had to work in the communism. It was not like in America that women could stay at home and bring up the kids. You know, everybody had to work, women and men equally. So men would go into the heavy industry and women into the light industry, basically.
Maybe I add a short story to that. If you consider Edith Weide, a German researcher, she made a PhD in photochemistry in the 1920s and then was the head of the ACFA experimental laboratories. And she invented in 1941, she invented the silver salt diffusion patents, and they were done in 1941. And as she was a member of the Nazi Party, these patents were simply given to the American allies. And a certain Mr. Land took this patent, and this is the story of Polaroid. And we have tried to I knew Edith very well in the 1970s and 80s. Anybody who chased on this history was sued by a Polaroid company with millions of money, so you couldn't do any research on that. And I think she was paid by Polaroid some royalties to be quiet. But that's a very typical female history, I suppose.
Well, it's working? It's open? Okay. Keep talking about since we crossed from Poland to the German border. You might be interested, if you're interested in the labor of women, there is a very nice piece of artistic research by Tobias Zieloni on the women working at the Orwo factory, which was the East German AGFA factory, so to speak. And it's interviews and photographs and films, and it's a very recent piece from like a year and a half ago, so you might be interested. And you also, if you don't know Tobias' work, be interested in it. So that's my footnote. And if anybody wants to dare to do the research on the Polaroid, the archives are at Harvard. So there you go, you have all the information now.
Thank you. Is there any other comments, questions? Yeah. Oh, yeah, sure.
Thank you. Thanks. Thank you all for the very interesting presentations. And shall I ask you in Greek, Marianna?
Ναι.
Ναι, καλύτερα, για σένα, ναι. Okay. Δεν είναι τόσο ερώτηση, όσο περισσότερο σκέψη γύρω από αυτό που είπες σχετικά με την Παρέν και την σχέση της με τη φωτογραφία, όσον αφορά την υποστήριξη που είχε απέναντι στην ίδρυση, ας πούμε, μιας σχολής για γυναίκες φωτογράφους και στη συνέχεια ό,τι τέλος πάντων έγραψε για τις αδελφές Κάντα ή Καντά τώρα... Κάντα. Σκεφτόμουν σε σχέση με αυτό που είπες ότι, ας πούμε, δεν έγραψε για την έκθεση της Χαλκίδας στα τέλη.
Έγραψε για την έκθεση της Χαλκίδας, φυσικά. Ναι. Απλά δεν έγραψε, δεν αναφέρθηκε στο φωτογραφικό τμήμα.
Στο φωτογραφικό, ναι, ωραία. Κάτι αντίστοιχο έχουμε και με τον Παρνασσό, γιατί και στον Παρνασσό τότε είχε γίνει έκθεση ερασιτεχνών φωτογράφων και ήταν η συμμετοχή των γυναικών πολύ σημαντική τότε Δηλαδή, πολλές ερασιτέχνηδες, ενδεχομένως από τα ανώτερα στρώματα. Εντάξει, αυτό χρήζει διερεύνησης, δεν ξέρω κατά πόσο...
Ναι, είναι το πιο πιθανό.
Ναι, κάποια ονόματα σίγουρα καταλαβαίνουμε ότι είναι από ανώτερη τάξη, που ασχολούνταν ερασιτεχνικά με ένα είδος που μάλλον ήταν και σχετικά ακριβό να ασχολείσαι από μόνη σου, έτσι, όχι σε ένα εργαστήρι. Ενώ αντίθετα σχολιάζει κάποιες εκθέσεις με γυναίκες ζωγράφους, έτσι, τη Λασκαρίδου, τη Φλωρά, ας πούμε, τις αναφέρει. Οπότε σκεφτόμουν ότι ίσως είναι πιο πιθανό αυτό που είπες, η θέση της φωτογραφίας την εποχή εκείνη και στον λόγο της εποχής, θέλω να πω, πώς θεωρείται, δηλαδή πώς την αντιμετωπίζουν τη φωτογραφία, ενδεχομένως περισσότερο σαν ένα επάγγελμα παρά σαν μια τέχνη, και έχουμε αυτή την διαφοροποίηση, ενώ για τη ζωγραφική θεωρεί πιο εύλογο να γράψει, ας πούμε.
Εκεί πήγε και εμένα το μυαλό μου, βλέποντας τα σχόλιά της, ότι στην αρχή το θεωρεί ένα καλό... Καταρχάς δεν είχε ξεκινήσει την δεκαετία του 80 όταν υποστηρίζει τη σχολή, την ίδρυση της σχολής φωτογραφίας, και όταν δημοσιεύονται... Βρήκα μία δημοσίευση στην εφημερίδα των Κυριών από το φωτογραφείο Ρωμαΐδη που έψαχνε για νεαρά κορίτσια για λεπτές φωτογραφικές ασχολίες, πιθανώς ρετούς ή κάτι τέτοιο. Δεν έχουμε ερασιτεχνική φωτογραφία εκείνα τα χρόνια στην Ελλάδα ιδιαίτερη, και φυσικά για γυναίκες, δηλαδή νομίζω είναι μέσα στη δεκαετία του 90 που ξεκινάει όλη αυτή η ενασχόληση. Επομένως, αναφέρεται στη φωτογραφία αποκλειστικά σαν επάγγελμα, θεωρώ, την δεκαετία του 80, και ακόμα και όταν στηρίζει τις αδερφές Κάντα και το εγχείρημα να ανοίξουν το πρώτο φωτογραφείο στην Αθήνα, γυναικείο φωτογραφείο, γυναικεία επιχείρηση, το στηρίζει με αυτό το γνώμονα. Έτσι το διάβασα εγώ τουλάχιστον. Όταν όμως η φωτογραφία ως ερασιτεχνικό χόμπι σιγά σιγά διεκδικεί μια άλλη θέση, νομίζω ότι δεν την αναφέρει καθόλου, δηλαδή σε αυτό το κομμάτι, και πιθανώς το φοβάται κιόλας, γιατί είναι πολύ... δεν θεωρείται τέχνη, θεωρείται βοηθητική τέχνη. Γενικώς την κατακρίνουν συνεχώς αυτό το επίπεδο τη φωτογραφία, στον κριτικό λόγο της εποχής. Επομένως ήταν λίγο το έδαφος όχι πολύ ευνοϊκό για να... και πιθανότατα και η ίδια, εγώ έχω αυτή την αίσθηση ότι και η ίδια έτσι πρέπει να έβλεπε τη φωτογραφία. Δηλαδή καλή ως επάγγελμα, πιθανώς για τα μεσαία στρώματα, αλλά για τις κυρίες καλής τάξης μόνο σαν χόμπι, ξέρω εγώ, και πάλι στο πλαίσιο αυτό της οικογενειακής φωτογραφίας και τα λοιπά. Δεν νομίζω ότι και η ίδια έβλεπε διαφορετικά τη φωτογραφία εκείνη την εποχή.
Να προσθέσω ότι νομίζω ότι έτσι κι αλλιώς δεν έβλεπε τη φωτογραφία σαν κάτι ξεχωριστό από τα άλλα γυναικεία επαγγέλματα, σαν επάγγελμα δηλαδή, οπότε το υποστήριξε στο βαθμό που εξυπηρετούσε το αίτημα της εποχής που έθετε η ίδια μέσα από την εφημερίδα της, ως φεμινίστρια, με τα δεδομένα της εποχής βέβαια φεμινίστρια, για τα δικαιώματα των γυναικών στην εργασία. Οπότε αυτή, δηλαδή η φωτογραφία, ήταν ένας από τους κλάδους, μαζί με άλλους κλάδους αντίστοιχους, περισσότερο βιομηχανικούς, των τεχνών, εφαρμοσμένες τέχνες που λέγαμε και πριν, που είναι περισσότερο κοντά στην αντίληψή της για την απασχόληση των γυναικών σε επαγγέλματα. Και όχι τόσο σαν κάτι ξεχωριστό, ας πούμε, σαν τέχνη, οτιδήποτε.
Ναι, έτσι νομίζω κι εγώ.
Ναι, και νομίζω ότι αυτό, έτσι κι αλλιώς μετά από μια εποχή, η Παρέν δεν το πολύ αναδεικνύει, γιατί είναι άλλου τα αντικείμενα που την ενδιαφέρουν, δηλαδή όταν γυρνάει ο αιώνας, θέλω να πω. Ευχαριστώ.
Thank you. Any more, maybe like a final, actually, comment or question? No? I know everyone is already quite exhausted by amount of exciting information you have received. So let's thank this panel. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and research.